Hey guys, Josh from the Ancient History Guy here. Hello and welcome to all. Hope you are having a fantastic day. Anyways, today we are going to be looking at Carthage's military, specifically its land forces, which, curiously, were made up of mercenaries. So the question now is why? Well, let's find out. Now, mercenaries have been around since, well, forever. In fact, they are often referred to as the second oldest profession. For those that don't know, a mercenary is basically a fighter who hires himself out to fight in a foreign army. As a result, they came in particular use when an army needed to bolster its ranks or make use of certain skilled fighters. For example, the Greeks found regular employment as mercenaries throughout the Mediterranean, noticeably in Persia, where their tactics and methods of fighting were highly valued, mainly against other Greeks who fought in the same way. Mercenaries didn't necessarily have to be fighting in these armies. A fair amount of the time, skilled mercenaries would be made generals. These mercenary generals are sometimes even tougher opponents than their non-contracted contemporaries, a noticeable example being Memnon of Rhodes, who on more than one occasion presented a particularly difficult challenge to invading Alexander the Great. To summarise, mercenaries were not a rarity in ancient warfare. They pretty much made a regular appearance on almost every single battlefield. However, they almost never made up the main fighting force of an army. You see, funnily enough, countries prefer to employ people that are, well, wholly loyal to them, rather than those that are loyal to coin. What was to stop the mercenaries from receiving a better offer from the enemy and switching sides after all? Now you could say honour, and back then this was a thing, however the fear of this possibility still remained. This also applied to non-citizens who after all could not be trusted to fight for the city they lived in, as well they had no blood tie to it. This meant that throughout much of ancient history, only citizens of a country could actually fight in their armies. This made battles even fiercer than they had ever been before, as soldiers were literally fighting for their homes. Indeed, there are only really two cases that come to mind of an army being nearly completely made up of mercenaries, and those are the armies of Cyrus the Younger, who employed 10,000 Greek mercenaries in order to combat his brother, and the standing army of Carthage. But why did Carthage have such a large mercenary force? Well, you see, Carthage, unlike a majority of the Phoenician colonies in the Western Mediterranean, was actually fairly militant. This was spurred on by the fact that after the fall of its mother city, Tyre, the Carthaginians felt duty-bound to protect the smaller Phoenician colonies, their cousins. As a result, Carthage became the military might behind a very loosely aligned Phoenician trade empire, with the smaller colonies of Sicily, Corsica and Sardinia often calling upon the huge Punic fleet to help protect them against their trade rivals, the Greeks. Trade between these two powers was often quite competitive. Greek wine was highly sought after, so the Punics would simply forge Greek brands onto their own wine vessels, passing off their own wine as Greek wine. The two powers inevitably came to blows, noticeably on Sicily, where the island was essentially split in two, with the Greeks controlling the east whilst the Carthaginians controlled the west. This war was particularly bloody, with organised hoplite armies smashing into one another. Carthage at the time deployed a similar citizen guard known as the Sacred Band of Carthage, which was armed in the Greek manner. However, even this elite guard was not enough, and after a climactic battle, the Sacred Band was essentially wiped off the face of the earth. Carthage, however, pressed on and managed to besiege Syracuse, one of the most important Greek cities outside of the Greek peninsula. Led by the Syracusians, the Greeks managed to break out of the siege and landed an invasion force on the shores of Africa, aiming at bringing Carthage to heel. Remarkably, these Greeks actually seem to have originally had quite a good time during the first stages of the invasion, as Carthage was so efficient at farming that both armies had enough food to sustain themselves. The Greeks also managed to turn many of the local tribes, noticeably the Libyans and Numidians, over to their side. However, their leader seemed to have been a bit of a sociopath, and would regularly present himself as a friend to these tribal leaders, and then, without warning, kill them. This meant that more often than not, allies would come and then very quickly leave as he had betrayed them. Needless to say, the campaign did very little except to convince Carthage to sue for peace, sparing the city from a siege. Carthage had avoided a siege, but it actually had a bigger problem. Its citizens' army had been completely decimated by the war, with only a relatively small reserve force remaining. There was nothing to stop the Greeks from returning, something that the Greeks were rumoured to be planning, and as they had no army, there was no way Carthage could fend off a now united Greek-Sicilian force. So what to do? Well, in a pinch, ancient armies had always hired mercenaries to replenish their lines, and so Carthage did the same, except on a much grander scale. Iberians and Balearics were sought after, with large contingents sent to replenish the depleted garrisons in Sicily. Libyans also found regular employment, making up the bulk of the infantry force, whilst allied Numidians provided the cavalry. Carthage ensured that these mercenaries wouldn't leave their service by offering permanent legal contracts as well as regular pay. This attracted many to the mercenary life, resulting in Carthage quickly rebuilding her forces. Needless to say, its citizenry had been decimated during the war. In terms of recruiting, priority had to be given to the navy, where only 3 men could actually serve. This was the norm throughout much of the classical world, and it was extremely rare to find slaves fighting in the galleys of the biremes. As a result, the mercenary army gradually became the norm for Carthage. Carthage still maintained some control over their army. Noticeably, several military families rose to prominence, most notable of which was Hamilcar and his rival Hanno. Both were powerful military leaders, with Hanno carving out a large amount of territory in Africa for the state. However, when Hamilcar pointed out that they needed men to defend Sicily, Hanno made sure to only give his rival the bare necessities. Hannibal made up for this by inspiring his men with promises of glory and riches. With this, he managed to hold off the invading Romans. However, a lack of military support from Hanno meant that eventually the Carthaginians were driven out of Sicily. However, after this first war with Rome, Carthage, it seemed, was in no state to actually pay their mercenary army its wages. Hanno also wasn't going to let his rival gain any more power, and therefore flatly refused to pay Hamilcar's army what had been promised. This resulted in the mercenaries rightfully mutinying, almost bringing Carthage to its knees. Hanno was initially put in charge of defeating the mercenaries, however he seemed to be unfit for the task, eventually having to ask Hamilcar for help. Hamilcar was able to defeat the mercenaries, bringing the mutiny to an end. Hamilcar then left for Hispania, hoping to plunder the wealth of the peninsula to help make up for the loss of the vital trade lanes to Rome. This surprisingly worked, with Carthage becoming rich off Hispanic mines and blacksmiths. This wouldn't be the end of mercenaries in the Carthaginian army. When Hannibal began his campaign against Rome, he had very little actual support from Carthage itself. As a result, a majority of his army were mercenaries from all across the empire. Noticeably were the elite Libyans, who more often than not had played a key role in Hannibal's battles. However, a majority of the army was made up of local allies that Hannibal had managed to sway to his side. This meant that the Gauls and Italians, who had been largely dissatisfied with Roman rule, made up a majority of his army. The Gauls in particular took quite a large beating, not helped by the fact that they were kind of looking for it. Hannibal noticed this, and during the Battle of Cannae, he was in the front lines, leading this particular group of allies himself. So what do I think of this? Well, I think it's interesting how a short-term solution essentially became a long-term one. The mercenary army of Carthage was initially just to replenish numbers, as they had to prioritise their navy. I also find it fascinating how we often just assume that Carthaginian citizens didn't fight in the armies because they were so wealthy they would rather pay to have someone else fight. In reality, a majority of Carthage's fighting citizens had to be prioritised for the navy, which was the source of both Carthage's wealth and power. But that's just what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching and listening to our videos. Be sure to like, comment and subscribe if you've enjoyed. All sources are listed and linked in the description below. I've been the Ancient History Guy, and as always, I'll be seeing you later.